Yes, we are live. Hello, good evening, everyone. I am Antara. So, in India, along with Durga Puja and Navratri, the season of festivals have already ushered in. So, tell me your story wishes a very Shubho Shoshti to everyone. So, as you know, the September 2021 issue of TMYS Review has gone up last month and it is available worldwide via Amazon. The issue focused on floods driven displacement in collaboration with Environmental Humanities Center, Amsterdam. So this is a celebratory panel where we also have Petra von Dom representing Environmental Humanities Center and two other contributors to the issue who are Neil Nagwekar and Megha Mazumdar. So let me introduce our esteemed guests. Petra Van Dam is a historian. She is a chair professor of water and environmental history in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, at the Free University. She is very interested in the relationship of humans and nature in the past. How humans deal with floods in Europe is one of her research topics, but she does also comparative work on America and Asia. With her work, she wants to contribute to more awareness about environmental change and she wants to promote societal resilience. We welcome you, Petra. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Next, we have Megha Majumdar, whose poem Bones and Banes got published in September 2021 TMYS Review. Megha is a student of English literature pursuing her post-graduation from St. Xavier's College, Kolkata, India. She is also a silver medal holder for her academic performance at Amity University, Kolkata. Megha has been scribbling poetry for a long time, and her major turning point in life has been Keats' trans-romantic poetry. She extends her reach to learning and writing multilingual poetry. Her current area of interest being Spanish Imagist poetry, Megha has published in several national and international journals, including the Criterion and IJELS. She has recently presented a paper at the ICSC conference on South Asian Canadian diaspora. Among her other presentations, contexts of the poem Boons and Banes have been drawn from A.K. Ramanujan's A River, 1965, William Wordsworth's It Is Not to Be Thought of, 1815, and Kalidasa's Meghaduta, 4th to 5th centuries CE approx. We welcome you, Megha, and
Thank you so much.
congratulations that you got
Thank you.
published on September TMY's Review 2021. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much.
Our third esteemed guest for today is author Neil Nagwekar. Neil Nagbaeker, 24, is from Mumbai, India. He is editing a political novel while completing his master's in English literature at the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. He has worked for Midday and co-directed a production at the National Center for the Performing Arts, Mumbai. His principal literary influences are Foucault, Marx, and T.S. Eliot. You can find him on Twitter at Neil Nagwekar, talking about football, the death of poetry in the age of Instagram, or his fan fiction that fixes the end of Game of Thrones. His essay, Morality and Flood Narratives in Indian Mythology got published in TMY's September 2021 issue. We welcome you, Neil, today. Thank you for being with us.
Pleasure to be your Antara. Thank you for having me.
Okay. Okay. And last but not the least, I am Antara and I am a writer from Kolkata, West Bengal, India. I have completed my post-graduation diploma in journalism and mass comm from Jadavpur University. Alongside, I have a master's in English literature. So I have taken up teaching as my profession, and poetry writing is also my passion. Recently, my book on poems, Percipience Poetry to Perceive, has been published by BFC Publications Private Limited across various online platforms like Amazon, Kindle, Amazon.com, etc. And I have been with Tell Me Your Story as a project assistant for the project Flood Driven Displacement, and have been a contributor for one of the project titled The Mask. And I also have a diploma in Hindustani classical music. So that is all about me. So let's take forward today's discussion with Petra. So we have a nice presentation by Petra, which has been already uploaded on the YouTube. Mm, uh, you can watch it on Environmental Humanities Center YouTube channel. The project titled is The Amphibious Culture of the Netherlands, Applying Daily Practices as Coping Mechanisms During Disastrous Floods. So, Petra, so my question to you is, what has been one of the main reason behind the origin of floods in Netherlands?
Thank you, Antara. We have a very small country and we have some very, very large rivers. The main river of Europe, the Rhine, ends in our country. So when the Rhine goes up high, it floods over the countryside. And although we have been building dikes for 1500 years almost, sometimes the Rhine is too high. And recently, this is a new story again because of all the climate change. The rain in Europe is changing the pattern. So we get rain that looks like tropical rain, like in your country. So a lot of rain at the same moment. And then the Rhine rises so high and so suddenly, then it goes over the dikes. And also very little rivers actually go over the boundaries. In this last summer, we had terrible problems in the south and also in the other country in Germany, and many people died. And whole villages were swept away, which is very uncommon for Europe. So yeah, and then we have a second problem, that's the North Sea. We have a very long coast at the North Sea, and the North Sea is connected to the Atlantic Ocean. And sometimes we have very big storm surges, and then the sea rises 4 or 5 meters above normal, and then it also floods the country. Now I'm laughing, but of course it's not something to laugh about this. Sorry.
No, that is quite understood. So, Petra, how these rising of sea level and such disasters driven by floods have affected the area? Can you please explain a little?
Well, when we have very large floods, large parts of the country are flooded, maybe 10%, but usually in the past we had few victims. So many people had losses, damage of the houses, damage of the cattle, of the harvest, but very few people died. And especially compared to floods in other countries, very few people died. And that is because the people had a strategy. They knew how to cope with the flood. I think that's very important. So first of all, they built most houses on small hills. So the top of the house remained dry. They could go to the second or the third floor in the house. Or they could flee to the dikes, and dikes are very high. This is not high, of course, but this is the countryside, and there's the dike. Very high dikes, 3, 4, 5 meters, and they could stay on top of the dikes. And then they could walk to the next city. And many cities were also at higher places. And all these dikes that we had, so a dike in English means like an embankment. It's a very high wall made of earth and grass. So it's not very strong, but it keeps for, say, 24 or 48 hours, and that's just enough to slow the water down. So the water does not come like in the sea. It's not like a tsunami. It's more very slow, and gradually it floods over the fields, and it's very awkward and very cold in winter. It's freezing usually here in winter. But the force of the water is not so strong, usually. So that's why people had a good chance to get away in time.
And in this regard, can you recall a recent flood which has taken place in the area?
Yeah, the most famous flood is 1953. And then the whole southwest of the country was flooded, 2 provinces. And unfortunately, then quite a number of people died, more than 2,000. In India, that would not be a lot, I think. In Asia, that would be a small number of people, but here it was one of the largest ever. We are only a very small country. And there were several reasons for that. The first reason was the flood was in the middle of the night, so everybody was sleeping. And the second reason was that the radio transmittance was stopped. So the people at the weather forecast station, they knew that the flood was coming, but because it was Saturday night, they closed the radio. We were then a very religious country, and on Sundays nobody should work. So even the radio closed down, and the last emergency calls did not reach the people in the area. So the warning was very bad. The warning system was very bad for that reason. And as a result, on Sunday, nobody knew that the country was flooded. So the people were sitting on their houses and in the trees waiting for 24 hours while there was a hailstorm and snow. And the whole of the country, nobody knew what was going on. Only a very few people discovered that the telephone lines were down. And then somebody sent out an airplane, that was the army. And then suddenly, on Monday morning, in the newspapers, there were photographs of this part of the country. It was totally in the water. It was totally disappeared. And so the people sat for 48 hours in the trees, and then they fell out of the trees. And all the houses that were still standing, they also fell apart. So in this case, the normal strategies did not work. That was 1953, just after the Second World War. And the basic reason for this flood was that the dikes were not high enough. And due to the war, maintenance was stopped. And after the war, all the money was spent on reconstruction of industry. And this was not a very important province for the government, so they did not work on the dikes. So after 1903, there was a big outcry in the country, everybody very angry. And then they decided to close all the waterways in this district, all the sea inlets, so that we built a huge series of very, very large dams, that at that time, the largest dams of the world. So it was a little late, but then after that, we had no problems anymore.
So, Petra, as you were mentioning about dikes and dams, so can you put some insights that how important it is to construction of dams and dikes, how effective it is behind withstanding floods?
Yeah, in our country, it's essential. 50% of our country is lying below sea level. So if we don't have dikes, then 50% of the country is flooded every day with high tide. And at low tide, it's empty again. So we need dikes for the normal, everyday tidal movement of the sea. And we also need them for storm surges. And with normal sort of average storm surges, they're okay. But I've done historical research over a very long period, and I can say that about once per century, so one time in 100 years, there is a disaster. So then the dikes break at many places, and then we have big problems. But usually this is related to a time of war or economic decline, which means that the dikes are not well preserved, not well kept, not well maintained, not high enough, the holes are not filled up again. So we can say that in general the dikes work well, but under special conditions they did not work.
Okay. Petra, in your presentation, in your PowerPoint presentation, you have mentioned about different sort of dikes and dams. So can you explain a little on that?
Yeah, there are major dikes, very high dikes at the side of the sea and at the side of the rivers. But in the inland, there are small dikes because we need drainage in our country. So it's like you often have irrigation in your country. So you have compartments that you can irrigate at different level of water. And we drain at a different level. So some parts are lower than other parts. They need more pumping stations. And therefore, inside in the country, there's many little dikes. And when we have a storm surge and the large dikes break at the outside, then the small dikes, they function as containment areas. So the water stays in one part and not moves directly to the other part. That's the great thing about the small inland dikes.
Okay. And can you give us some insights, like how do usually, once a flood happens, it destroys the entire area, the entire land. So post post of any flood or a disaster, how do people cope with the situation in your area?
Yeah, well, it is a very simple rule. Rich people cope very well and poor people cope very badly. That is the most general statement I can make, because rich people often have territories at several places. They have one farm here and a small farm somewhere else, or maybe they have 10 different farms at 10 different places. So not all of their property is destroyed. Also, they may have savings in the bank or in other ways. In the past, the bank did not exist, so they would have savings in kind or cattle, lots of amounts of cattle or goods. They would have goods somewhere stored. There would be an international trade, investments in the financial market, shares bought from companies. So they had the reserves and they could recover. They would simply restore their farms and buy seed again and start agriculture again. But poor people would lose their house and their cattle. And for them, it was very hard. There were a few comforts. Usually, immediately after the disaster, the water authorities started rebuilding the dikes, and they would attract lots of laborers. So the poor people could act as laborers and earn a wage. So it was not necessarily that they became very destitute, like they would die or something. So many of them the thousands and thousands in the area could earn a wage on the dikes for months on end, so they could start building up again. Also, their houses were usually not totally destroyed, but only partially. Or if the family was bigger, maybe one house was still okay, 2 houses were half damaged, and 3 houses were gone totally, because the houses in the higher parts were better preserved. So there was, from an economic point of view, you can say there was some capital left that they could use to restart life again. Also, from about 1800 onwards, there was national relief measures. So there would be committees per district that would go around and look what the damage is, and they would hand out money to the people that was collected in the cities and other areas that were not affected. So these relief committees started once the Netherlands became a kingdom in 1813. And before that, it did not happen, but only at a very local scale. So maybe a local church would collect money in one village for another village, or one city for another city, or 3 cities for one city. So the system of helping already existed, say from 1500 until 1800, but after 1813 it became much better organized.
Okay. Okay, Petra, in your presentation, you have also mentioned about rescue efforts for the flood-driven people and how transport can help tremendously. So can you tell something about that?
Yeah, that was the one advantage that we had in this little country, because it's low-lying and because it's drained everywhere. You have many, many, many canals and ditches and lakes and rivers. So transport was always by water. In normal days, normal goods, the bread, in your case the rice, but the grain and the cattle and the grass and the hay, everything was, even of course the people and the dead people and the firearms, everything was transported by boats. So there were boats everywhere. Every farm would have a boat, every merchant would have a boat, in the cities, in the villages. So when the waters rose, people could also take the boat and transport goods and people to safer places. And that, you can say, is also part of the strategy, a strategy of coping with floods. These boats were not made for dealing with floods, they were just there, but because they were there, they were very convenient, of course. This whole water transport also helped people to survive and helped and contributed to the fact that not so many people died.
Okay. And so what sort of measures do you suggest to scale down floods, Petra?
In my country,
Yes, in your country.
well,
And also in general, also, if you want to say,
well, this
it
is
can be a general opinion as well.
very big question, Antara. Very, very big question, because we are having sea level rise all over the world due to climate change. And many people presume this is human-induced climate change, that people have made climate change. So, and the sea level rise is a major cause for future floods. And the river rising in Europe are a cause for future floods, and that is due to climate change and other patterns of rain. So what we should actually do is get rid of the climate change, redress the climate change. But personally, I think we will work very hard for that, but it will not come soon enough. So in the meantime, now let's start from the idea that we will stop this climate change in a couple of years. Let's hope for that. But in the meantime, the waters will be rising. So what the Dutch government does, the government of my country, they have already started making the dikes much higher. The sea dikes are ready. They started already 10 years ago. They're all set now. And the amount of sand they use to do that, it's just amazing. I would be happy to show a video, but it's just such a very big ships with very large amounts of sand that we put on the coastal defenses. And the next thing they're doing now is also raising all the dikes in the inland country. So if it rains, we can just move the water to certain areas that we flood. So they act as reservoirs, so that the rivers are not overloaded, and also our drainage systems in the towns, which is a different story, but also our drainage system are completely not sufficient anymore for the new types of rain. But you may know that also from your country.
Okay. So basically, we need to, take a stand against climate change. We need to plant more trees, and with this only we can curb floods, I think. Because in India also this year we had floods. We are getting a lot of rains this year in India,
Yeah.
which is really absurd. Yes, and there has been floods. So we need to do something against that. And as you rightly said, that climate change is one of the biggest factor. So we
Yeah.
need to do something so that.
Yeah, you talk about planting trees. I think that's very friendly and very peaceful, and it's very important. But of course, the main problem of climate change is the fossil fuel that we throw into the air. That comes from industry, from houses, and from transport. And that's our main issue, to have an energy transition, to get away from the fossil fuels, from the coal and the wood, and change to sun energy, wind energy, maybe nuclear energy, though that's very risky. And as a means of transport of this energy, we need a lot of inventions, because that at the moment is our main problem. We can in this country we can produce lots of solar energy, but during the night that's useless. So during the night you cannot use sun energy, and also the wind is enough in the daytime and not in the night. So for the night we need some sort of batteries, enormous batteries, and that is the problem at this moment in technology, from what I know from a friend of mine who is a professor of alternative and in energy. So the battery problem is at the moment a problem. Yeah.
That was wonderful explanation, Petra. Thank you so much. And I just want to just end it with a question like, has there been any such experience, Petra, which you have observed very closely, that of a flood? Has there personal experience?
Fortunately, I've never been in a flood and have no desire
Good,
to
good.
be in a flood, but the 1953 flood has produced so much videos and photographs in this country and so many stories that it almost feels as if I've been there. I've read so much about the 1953, I have the feeling I know every detail. And we also had a lot of films, fiction films also, and more documentary films, so we can also imagine very well. I can almost feel the cold of the water and the hailstorm on my hair is sitting in the trees, and the cramp in my hands falling off the trees, and all the other horrible stories that we've heard of this flood. That feels very close.
Well, that was really terrible. Anyways, thank you, Petra, for sharing such nice stories on floods and everything. And you shared your some suggestions also how to cope with floods and how to curb floods. So thank you, Petra. And now let's go on to the second part of our session, which is like we have our two esteemed guests, Megha Mazumdar and Neil Nagwekar. So, Megha, your poem Boons and Banes got published on September TMYS Review 2021. So, what was like? What was your inspiration behind writing this poem?
Okay, thank you for inviting me so sweetly, Antara, and thank you, Petra, for such a wonderful session. Like, it was extremely insightful, and now when I think about my inspiration behind writing this poem, I think it's kind of same all over the world. It doesn't really depend on the country which is being flooded or the area which is being flooded. It's common, quite common. And if you ask about my inspiration, I think all the poets, all the writers would agree. It's really difficult to actually trace back what I was thinking back then when I wrote something like that. And it's actually it depends on a calamity. And when I'm writing about it, it actually what Virginia Woolf explains as the stream of consciousness. So it's more like that. There is no pause, nothing, and I just keep writing. Maybe editing takes away like like way harder work than when I'm writing it. So if I think about the inspiration, then I would like to say like specifically what happened after the Amphan storm in West Bengal and Orissa. I think that was a huge inspiration behind my poem, but because I wrote the poem during that time itself. And personally, from a privileged point of view, I'm sitting in my room and talking about it today, and I don't know where those people are who suffered through the flood. And like when I was writing about it, I was overwhelmed with like deep misery in my heart, but there's nothing I could do except for really maybe sending a relief fund or donating something or the other I had. But I think this poem was at least a little bit of satisfaction in my heart to actually read it back again and see that, okay, I was maybe aware of feeling it. And like I was capable of feeling it, and I was kind of aware what these people were going through. And when I wrote it, I tried to inculcate everything that went through the consciousness of these people and the psychology of the people who suffered. And I think that was one of the major inspirations. And then when I edited it, I kind of thought about like what I can put in and what I cannot, because I have to consider the extreme sensitivities of the people who will be reading it, who might have had some experiences in the flood. So yeah, I think that was one of the inspirations. I mean, if you read the poem, when I read the poem once again these days, I feel like just one thing led to the other. And the main inspiration would be that like striking misery that kind of pinches you in your heart when you think about all these, and then you can't
And
really take it out. And the
Neil,
poem and writing is the way to actually put it. Yeah.
can you talk a little about your metaphorical implications which you have used in your poem? Just can you talk a little about that?
Okay. So I'll say that as a student of literature, I think all of us will agree that we come across poems on natural calamities quite often. And it's not just biased to a particular country. I mean, we have seen A.K. Ramanujan writing about floods, R.K. Narayan writing about floods. And then there are people like John Milton writing about floods in such a time, like extremely ancient, and we were not even capable of understanding what went through England at that time. And then we see William Wordsworth writing about flood, and all these people kind of take on flood in a very distinct and their own individual way. So when I was writing, I tried to stick to metaphors because, as a poet, as a person, I am kind of not comfortable expressing all that I'm feeling in a way. So that's where metaphors kind of come to your rescue. I feel like that. And so if you read my poem, you'll see words like um, I have used something extremely superficial, like how I felt the water in my skin, and that is just a superficial way of putting like how I felt it inside my heart, inside my senses, in my brain. And like I have mentioned, how I'm sitting in my well-odorant yellow room and I'm feeling all that is happening. It's like an ambush. It's like a sudden attack of gray waters. And I particularly mentioned the word gray because it is as ambiguous as the qualities of a flood. Because for some people, it's extremely rewarding. Some part of the population who are going through drought, going through dryness, who are going through an agricultural decay in a way. For them, flood helps. But at the same time, on a different part of the world, flood kind of ruins lives and houses and settlements and even even the will to live in a way. And we see, like, unfortunately, different cases of suicides and self harm and self killing as an outcome of the flood. So I think my metaphors kind of I used them while I was editing my poem, and I feel like the metaphors were kind of a way to not really portray very openly to the world what I was going through. So yeah.
That was wonderful, Megha. It was very
Thank you.
vivid and wonderful. And now going on to Neil. Neil, your essay, Morality and Flood Narratives in Indian Mythology, got published on the September review, TMYS. So, Neil, what was your inspiration behind writing this essay?
Uh, I don't know about inspiration. Uh, I think I think we are living in a very sensitive time in India today, where on the one hand there is a sort of unambiguous valorization of Indian mythology in general, and on the other hand there is a complete discrediting of all that it entails. So I think that part of it deserves to be discredited, of course. Part of it is obsolete and has become irrelevant as time has gone on. But I think we can also learn even today a lot from what the parables or the myths were trying to say about even today. My motivation, may not call it inspiration, but my motivation behind this paper is that I had heard of these stories a little here and there. So when I did a complete reading of all these texts, I realized that there were certain moral nuggets in the parables that they were trying to express, which should be sort of repackaged from these half reliable stories into today's times, repackaged for contemporary audiences, so that we all know what we think about it. You know, the jury may be out on whether the morals that they espouse are really worth following, or maybe they should be partially accepted, or maybe wholly accepted, or maybe wholly rejected. But I think that too much emphasis is on, say, plot holes, you know, or on storylines, which is not really the point of parables. So I think my motivation was to figure out what they were trying to say and then put the jury out on should this be relevant in today's time. So I think while doing that, I used three narratives, three broad narratives. One was the Andaman and Nicobar legends and tales. One was the famous Matsya Puran story about Vishnu, and one was a story from Samudvanya Jatak about a bunch of lazy carpenters from Banaras. And they all include floods. To put it very broadly, I think they all include people doing immoral things, those people being punished by a flood like event, and the reason for that flood like event is a sort of purge or a sort of punishment, a sort of reaction to where humanity has gone. So, uh, I mean, I don't want to talk too much about the stories individually because that will take us ages. But I think very broadly, the Andaman and Nicobar stories appeal to me because they had two or three different narratives. In fact, they had eight or ten, of which I included two or three. Two or three different narratives of one event. And those two or three different narratives showed a different moral side of things, which led to the flood. I also think that the god who caused the flood, Huluga, is much more humanized in these stories. The Matsya Puran is, of course, the most popular flood narrative in Indian mythology. And even that has two very distinct narratives that I think are worth talking about. Buddha, the story about the Buddhist story about the lazy carpenter from Banaras is interesting because it has two gods in it, where one god says that a flood is going to happen, the other god says that the first god was lying, the flood is not going to happen. You guys do what you think, and then you see what humans react to what gods are saying. So I think that has a lot to say about misinformation or lobbyists or things like that. So I think my motivation was to read all of these stories and figure out what they were trying to say and what could be tackled even today.
Okay, that was wonderful, Neil. Thank you for sharing. And I would request now, Petra, that what are your questions or requests or advices to, I would request Petra to advise Megha and Neil on their publications. They got themselves published.
Thank you. Right. Well, you are very polite asking me for advices. I prefer to ask questions because these are the experts of the stories on the matter. So what can I advise them? Now, for Maya, I think you have written a wonderful poem. It's full of atmosphere of this horrible flood experience, but it also contains a few riddles for me. And the first is you mentioned the Rama Nuyans monster at Madurai. Can you explain a little that to me? What is it and why is it important? What is the function and the meaning in this poem?
Thank you for the question, Petra, and thank you for all the sweet words. So, as I was saying in my answer previously to Antara, that when I was writing this poem, I kind of thought about all the writers that have written on flood in a way. And A.K. Ramanujan's poem, A River, is kind of set in a post colonial setting in India. And we find traces of how he kind of deviates from the stereotypical notion of the romanticism of flood by most romantic poets of Europe and as well as India. So we have seen kind of like how poets every year they would wait for a calamity in a way and kind of romanticize on it. Like it might be just something as important as flood, or maybe something just as liminal as like maybe what like a particular any kind of natural calamity that kind of works as a metaphor in many romantic poems. Like I remember one of I think William Blake's poems where he uses the crack of the earthquake as a crack in his heart. So I think these are extremely romantic uptakes of very serious issues, and where Ramanujan, being from a third world country, uh, chooses to specifically point out a very significant flood in Mysore, Madurai, and he talks about this river, which his name he doesn't really mention, and he talks about how this river kind of invites poets all over the world to kind of be impregnated in their poem in a way. But and all these poets kind of praise about the beauty of the flood, the size of it, the power of it, the like the gushing of water it kind of comes up with every year. But nobody really talks about what happens underneath. I mean, then he sits in front of the riverbank and imagines everything, how maybe a pregnant woman who was supposed to maybe give birth to twins in a way, and who had also kind of decided on the name of their twins, names of the twins, might have got washed away with the flood. And then maybe just livestock, or and as we talk about the rural setup of India, we kind of think about the agricultural surplus and livestock and cattle and whatnot, poultry as well. So Ramanujan also points out in a way that this quote unquote monster is capable of washing away people's expectations with maybe income and profession, where like 70% of the Indian subcontinent consists of farmers still today, and they depend on agricultural surpluses and several livestock professions. And this particular flood, as a natural calamity, is capable of washing away everything in a way. So it's not just only the people who are getting directly affected by this monster, like the woman who was supposed to give birth to the twins is directly killed by the flood, but it's also the people who are indirectly affected in a way, because for the farmers, if their agriculture surplus is gone, there's nothing really that they can hold on to, and they eventually think about killing themselves because they can't really afford therapies like us. But that's what kind of Ramanujan points out, that this is actually a monster, and we kind of romanticize this monster like John Milton did for Satan in Paradise Lost. That is a totally different context, but in a way, this is the dark side of romanticizing something which we do not have a direct access to. We just see it from a third perspective, and we think about, oh, how beautiful this is. How maybe we see pictures on Google and think about, oh, how beautiful it looked when the flood was coming over. It's so thrilling and mysterious, but ultimately it's extremely like destroying and destructive. And that's what I meant in my poem when I said that I, as a person who is writing the poem, I'm thinking about all that is going on in a particular place which I can't really have an access to, but I can only sit here and think about it. So I think I felt like A.K. Ramanujan in a way where I could just sit and contemplate and think about how destructive it could be.
Right. So in your explanations now, I feel a sort of discrepancy or maybe even a criticism of Western European ways of describing floods by the Romantic poets, because they obviously only looked at it as a divine phenomenon, a grand spectacle in nature, and they did not really look at the victims. Of course, in England, when there was a big flood, there must have been victims too. I'm a little surprised that they were so unconnected to the sorrows of the average people. But I also wonder what kind of flood they were describing, because sometimes artists, they overdo very much. They're sitting next to a waterfall, for instance, a natural waterfall, and then they may imagine it's a flood, and then they get this very poetic interpretation of a flood. So as a historian, I now become very curious what kind of floods were described by Wordsworth and the other poets you actually named. For in my country in the 19th century, there were also a few devastating floods. 1825 has been very famous. That was the once a century flood. And as a result of that, we got a lot of poems about the sadness of the flood. So it was all about tears and people crying and people devastated and babies floating on the water to nowhere. And so in our country, this romanticism was very much focused on the suffering of the people. So I'm a little surprised that it was not so in England. Well, I'm not a literature person, so this probably is just matter for more research. I also had another question. Is there time for that, Antara?
Yes, we have.
But maybe it's the same question. On page 6 of your poem, it's the second section, it says, the romantic rendezvous between flood and freedom in the West. But is that maybe exactly what you've just been describing? Is this West India, or is it Western Europe?
In a way, so, because in this part, I have talked about this very poem of Wordsworth that's called "It's Not to Be Thought of," and it's a sonnet actually, and the very title of the poem kind of continues in the rest of the body of the poem, and he kind of goes on how it is not to be thought of the flood that the British Empire was in a way. So it is kind of a very different context, but when I read the poem, I kind of found it extremely relevant in what I was writing, because Wordsworth kind of brings about the context of the medieval War of Roses that kind of continued for more than 30 years, 1555 to 87, if I'm not wrong. And there is this poem about the pomps of water, if I'm quoting right, that came out in 1595, right after the War of 8 years of War of Roses. So, and then Wordsworth kind of brings in that concept, which kind of described how the English power as if became this gargantuan, big, gigantic water flood that flowed into the rest of the world to establish its power, and in a way kind of used its independence from the entire civil war that was going on in England to take over the throne, as you're all aware of. So, and especially against the French. So, in a way, Wordsworth kind of takes that context of that very unanimous poem, and he talks about how this British power is capable of establishing its grounds in a way which are not really helpful to a lot of people. I'll not get very political in this, but we all know how the colonialism affected the rest of the world, our own country in a way. So this context I borrowed because it kind of reminded me how I was just talking about dichotomy of flood, the very double-sided face of flood, and in a way it benefits a lot of people, in a way it kind of devastates, kills people. And Wordsworth talks about this, that it was a very good time for the British, it was a very good time for the English throne in a way, because people say that Edward IV was the right ruler for the English throne at that time. But then it kind of got really dark, and we call it the Middle Ages for the same reason. So we are not really aware of what was going on, and till today we see such impact of the harsh British colonial rule. So in a way, this was also a flood that impacted people's lives in a way, in a good way, as well as in a very bad way. So I think this was the dichotomy I was trying to put in my poem while referring to Wordsworth.
I see. Thank you. Thank you.
So Petra, you have got questions for Neil Nagwekar for his
Yeah,
essay.
Neil.
Please go ahead, Petra.
Right. Neil, you wrote a fascinating essay called Morality and Flood Narratives in Indian Mythology. And in the previous round of questions, you already told us which three legends you were dealing with, from the Satapatha Brahmana and from the Andaman Islanders and from the Jataka. And I was wondering, there must be many more flood narratives in India, so why did you choose these three specifically?
Uh, there are many more. I chose these three for several reasons. I think, firstly, I think that these three narratives, because they are from three different regions of India, they can come like 1% close to expressing a sort of India in general. Of course, that is very difficult to do, and I don't think that my essay can completely cover India. I think you need a much longer word count to do something like that. Having said that, I included these three narratives because all of them have something unique to say when it comes to today's time. So when you talk about the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, the legends of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, I think there you see several versions that narrate the same story. So there is a story of the flood which is caused by Puluga, and there is an Akajiru version, an Akaked version, and an unnamed version which is considered as the most the most popularly known version. And one version will talk about how there were these two people. I won't mention names and stuff to go too deep into it, but there were these two people. They were breaking firewood, and immediately this flood just came, and then they took the fire with them, and they managed to hide in a cave and get saved. So that shows a very different spin on the narrative. It's more like a flood simultaneously occurred. The cause for that was unknown, but they managed to get away with it and they managed to save the fire, which is the very elemental substance in this narrative. So that has a slightly different spin compared to the Akakede version. The Akakede version is about how there are these people who are collecting honey, and there are these other group of people who are just disturbing them. They make a great noise, they disturb their stop, they disturb their singing, and they do things that bring discord into the community, you know. And it's after this happens that there arises a great storm. It rains very heavily, the sea rises over the land, and it rises very rapidly until only the top of a tree can be seen above the river. And after this happens, people realize that it's because of what we did that this flood occurred. So they again the narrative combines the Akajiru version where they run and they rescue the fire and things like that. The unnamed version, which is the most popular one, is my favorite because it posits more clearly what the cause of the flood was. At the commencement of the rainy season, there is a tomola. A tomola is like an ancestor of an Andamanese ancestor. So there is a tomola who comes to visit someone by whom he is extremely jealous. So long story short, he bites him in the arm, thus killing the person. But when he bites him in the arm, his teeth becomes fixed in the flesh, so he's unable to detach himself. So the person who he killed, they take revenge by killing this person. Then the person who died in the first place, their mother, whose name is Kanaere, gets very angry and commits a lot of, in rage, grief, and despair, commits various acts against which she was warned against by the creator Puluga. So Puluga gets angry, he exceeds wrath, sends the floods, destroys all living things with the exception of two men and two women. So you get three very distinct morals here. In the first story, you get the moral of a flood might occur anytime, but you have to be on your toes perhaps, and you have to fend for yourself and you have to preserve fire. And coincidentally, the fire they preserve turns out to be the fire that lights up Andaman Island in the future. In the future stories, you get a moral of don't upset the wrath of gods. Don't mess around with who are the higher beings. It's more of a Greek mythological aspect here, where they have your destinies laid out for you, and if you interfere with them, then they will bring floods and they will purge you. So I like these narratives from the Andaman and Nicobar Islands because they are diverse. All of them include a flood. All of them are described in a similar way. They include cicadas and things like that, cicadae and things like that. But that is what interested me about it. What interested me more about the other two versions was that in the Matsya Avatar, in the Matsya Puran version, there are two competing versions of the story. And in the first version of the story, you have a person named Manu who saves a fish out of mercy, out of compassion, out of generosity. And it's only later he realizes that this is actually Vishnu in disguise. And it is because of his inherent inbuilt mercy that he becomes the perfect candidate to become the sort of Noah of Ark who takes all the sages and takes all the seeds and takes the people, and Vishnu tells him that a flood is coming and you have to be prepared and things like that. So he becomes a candidate out of his own moral system. This is different to how Satpat Brahman narrates the same story. In there, the fish comes to Manu. The fish tells Manu, "Rear me, I will save you." And Manu asks, what will you save me from? And that is when the fish says, "A flood is going to come. The flood will carry away all these creatures. From that, I will save you." So here, it's the fish who's giving Manu these instructions. And the moral changes from having inherent mercy or generosity to completely submitting to a transcendental being, to a God. So it's this kind of Old Testament, New Testament difference in morality. When in the Old Testament you listen to the God who is all powerful, who dispenses justice, yada yada yada. Whereas in the New Testament it has more to do with your inherent morality, your inherent mercy, which will lead you to be the chosen one. So these two morals, which narrate the same story, interested me. And I think the last story, which is about the Lazy Carpenter from Banaras, that interests me because you have two competing voices, as I previously mentioned. So just to give a very brief summary of the story, because we're running out of time, uh, there are these carpenters, these lazy carpenters, who happen upon a paradise, and food spawns on the island, and they can do what they want, they can have fun. The only condition is that whenever they urinate, whenever they defecate, they must cover what they leave behind with sand and things like that. Predictably, they fail to meet even this low barrier of expectation, which is why a god, who is the god of that island, gets angry and tells them that this island is going to be flooded in X amount of days. You have paid this basic requirement. Leave or you will be killed. Soon after that, another god appears and says the previous god was a trickster. Don't listen to the previous god. You can do as you wish. Party, rave, have fun, do what you like. This is where there is a conflict and there is a eventual split between the carpenters, where one side says that, okay, this God told us that there's going to be no consequence for what he just did, so let's just enjoy. While the other side says, let's build a ship. In case the flood does happen, we'll all stay on the ship and we'll all survive. And if the flood doesn't happen, then we have a ship. What's the big deal? Predictably, the flood does happen. Half the carpenters, 500 families die, and the wise people survive. So I think, especially this story, which might be my favorite of the three narratives, it shows you how we are existing in today's context. Because in the essays that I wrote, I mentioned the floods in Kerala, and I mentioned how after these floods happened, which is unnatural by any scientific metric, climate change denial lobbyists still blamed deforestation and land use patterns, when the true causes were something much deeper. It was improper soil piping, illegal and unsafe mining, high-rise building constructions, and climate change. So,
well, Neil, this is a very, very elaborate answer on the simple question from why do you choose these three narratives? And you also actually have started to answer the two other questions I have, which were about how do you relate these narratives to the present and how do you relate myth to religion. But Antara, I'm not sure we have any more time for that.
So it covers almost all of your questions, Petra. It covered like whatever Neil said. So you have any further more questions, Petra?
No, thank you.
To Neil or Megha?
No, thank you. I was very pleased to talk with you today. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for the questions as well. I'm sorry that I digressed too much.
Okay, congratulations, Megha and Neil once again. And to all the viewers who are watching us today. We have almost come to the end of today's session. And the PowerPoint presentation by Petra, let me tell you once again, the amphibious culture of the Netherlands, applying daily practices as coping mechanism during disastrous floods. It will be available very soon on our Tell Me Your Story social media platform. The link will be uploaded very soon. So you can, obviously, all of you can watch it over there. It's a awesome and a wonderful presentation made by Petra Vonda. And this is to remind that Tell Me Your Story September Review 2021 is now available on Amazon. So please let us know your feedback on the same. And I thank all of you, Petra, Megha, and Neil, for joining us today. And it was a very insightful session. Thank you, all of you, and happy puja to everyone. And let me tell you, Petra, for your information, right now it's the festival time in India. So uh, thank you, all of you. Thank you all. And here is Antara signing off for today. Goodbye. Take
Bye
care.
bye.